Welcome back. We're now shifting our attention from Italy to Europe outside of Italy, or what we collectively refer to as the North. So we're now going a little bit backward in time. We were just in the Renaissance. We're going to back up and go to the early part of the Renaissance and work our way forward. But generally speaking, most art historians refer to Renaissance outside of Italy in the rest of Western Europe as the Northern Renaissance. We're going to look first at the area known as, this time is a duchy ruled by a duke. The area that is at the time in the 15th century known as Burgundy is of course still in existence today. It's where Burgundy wine comes from, a region that is sort of sandwiched between what becomes modern-day France and modern-day Germany. So a lot of the artists that you're seeing here have some connections to both Germany and to French traditions in art. We'll look at the work in particular of Benike, Robert Campin, and a Hieronymus Bosch. I think you'll really like his work quite a lot. So here's the general region that we're looking at. And Burgundy is an area that becomes a little bit larger over time. The area that is Burgundy at the ascension of the Duke Philip the Bold is in this light blue area here. And over the course of his reign, he adds in these red sections. By the time his successor, Philip the Good, takes control, all of that same territory is his. He adds the blue, and these sections in black are also under Burgundian control. So the area that eventually we will refer to as the Netherlands and what we will eventually refer to as Belgium are under the influence of the Duke of Burgundy during the Renaissance. So the work that we'll see in the North can be distinguished work that we saw in Italy by a couple of features. Number one, there's much more detail, especially in the earlier work, compared to the work of the same time period in Italy. We'll also see that the compositions tend to place the figures closer to the picture plane, closer to our space, and often there's a little bit more drama, more anxiety, more darkness, both in the subject and in the way that things are depicted. If the images of the crucifixion, for instance, in Northern Renaissance are going to be much more gruesome, much more bloody, and a little bit more gory than what we're accustomed to seeing in Italy. This is the work of a Burgundian sculptor, Klaus Sluther, and I wanted you to see this figure in particular because you'll recognize him. His hair is making little horns. That's Moses. You can see the laws there in his other hand. When we look at the art in the North, you can really see what makes it different from Italy. When we open up this altarpiece, you can see this incredible level of carved detail on the interior space. You would never see something with this much fussy little tiny architectural detail this early in Italy, really. This is really an amazing example of some of Sluther's carving. This is the tomb, coffin of Philip. So the figures from that space look almost like contemporary or modern sculpture when you isolate them, but overdone point of view what an Italian sculptor would do. The Limburg brothers are the best example I can give you of artists who created illuminated manuscripts. It's a vocabulary you definitely want to be familiar with. An illuminated manuscript is essentially an illustrated book, and this particular book was made for Philip the Bold's brother, Jean. Jean was the owner of this particular Book of Hours, and a Book of Hours is essentially a prayer or a book for a member of the laity, a member of society who is not part of the church in terms of being a monk or a nun, a priest or a bishop. When you look at the Book of Hours, its job or its function is to help guide your prayers of a year. So you can see that each one of these pages equates to a month. There's an astrological calendar at the top as well, and it helps to guide you as to which prayers, which sections of the Bible to read, what prayers are appropriate for different times of year. The interesting thing about this piece, to me, is that it alternates between images of the wealthy aristocracy and images of the peasant class. So even though it was owned by a man, it really does kind of force that person to have to think about how the other half live. You can clearly see that in the difference between these two pages here. This is January, February, March, April, August to December. Jan van Eyck is our next big name to know, really an incredible painter, and he's working in oils much earlier than this in Italy would be doing. You can see that he's very gifted at working in an enormous amount of detail in a really, really small area. You can clearly see that in this piece here, this diptych. We zoom in on it, you can see the horrors of hell would be. There's figures being flayed apart, things being attacked by demons. You can see things being eaten. There's a really scary vision of what hell might be. Perhaps the scariest is this demon that has a mouth in its stomach. Pretty intense. So then going to be a little bit more detailed, figures a little closer to the picture plane, a little gorier, a little more dramatic. Jan van Eyck, like many artists of the Burgundian early Renaissance, began his career working on smaller surfaces, painting on objects that were used within the household, so doing what we might call miniature work. And a lot of the Northern Renaissance artists do this. They pack an enormous amount of detail space. Generally, they work more with oil, and Jan van Eyck is sometimes referred to as the inventor of oil painting, which is inappropriate. Other people used it before him, but he certainly perfected it. This is one of his altarpieces, and this is the altarpiece closed. It could be images on the inside. The thing I really love about it is it shows us our patrons who paid for it, alongside what appear to be sculptures. They really look like they could be real. Both the people and the statues are so meticulously done. His Annunciation scene above, though, is my favorite part of the painting because it shows you the framing device casting a shadow into the room where the angel and Mary are interacting. And so it really creates the illusion that this is a real space that we're looking into, and the light from our space is throwing a shadow into their space. That gives you a sense of the scale of these paintings. Right? When you see it on a lecture slide, it's one thing. When you see people next to it, it's really quite remarkable. And that's the interior. One of the rare depictions of God the Father. You also see Adam and Eve over to the side. Not that this is my favorite painting of his necessarily, but it does blow me away by the detail in the fabric in particular. Highlight and shadow on fabric is really a hallmark of making things look three-dimensional for sure, but the meticulous way that Van Eyck is able to get the perspective correct on this intricately woven pattern, it's really pretty remarkable. When you see it up close, is just astonishing. It almost looks like you could reach in and touch the texture. You can see the different threads raised and lowered as this piece. You really believe that you're looking at real fabric as opposed to a reproduction of that fabric. This is a Van Eyck to know for the test. This is the Arnolfini wedding portrait, and last name ending in I-N-I, Arnolfini sounds kind of Italian, and in fact he Italian. He's an Italian living abroad. He's living and working in Burgundy. And one of the decisions he makes to kind of secure his position and to help his marry a Burgundian woman. So he becomes closer connected, closer tied to the place from a business point of view through the marriage. The image that you're seeing is kind of deceptive because we wouldn't read this as a wedding. If anything, she looks like she's already pregnant, and they seem to be in their. But by Burgundian law in the early Renaissance, you could get married simply by saying the correct promises to one another of witnesses, and you didn't have to have a priest, you didn't have to have a civil servant, you could perform the ceremony yourself. So they are getting married in home, and in fact her pregnancy is a deception as well. If you look at the amount of fabric at the back of the dress, you can see that she's actually amount of fabric up and kind of balled it up in front here to suggest more roundness in the belly. What she's doing is really kind of getting a visual symbol for us that suggests she's not pregnant yet, but she will be. And notice that her wedding gown is green instead of what we're accustomed to seeing as white. Green, of course, is a color we associate with spring and with rebirth of plants, so obviously this is about her fertility. Most of the objects in the painting have a spiritual symbolic significance. They are what we call iconographic symbols, visual symbols that represent ideas to us. For one, the dog is a symbol of fidelity. The shoes that they've taken off is a symbol that they are reverence of God. What you see here is a very expensive candelabra or chandelier that only has one candle, or more than one candle. The single lit candle is a reference to the symbolic presence of God in the room. On the bedpost is a carving of St. Anne, who's the patron saint of pregnant women. If you look really close at this painting itself is not very large. It is less than 3 feet tall. It's not quite 2 feet in width, so it's really not. When you zoom in close, though, on this small section and blow it up really big, you can see Van Eyck's signature in this incredibly elaborate graffiti wall. And we can also see the backs of the married couple in this mirrored object in their bedroom, which also has these miniature what Van Eyck trained to do early on that show the stages of the crucifixion. What we also see in the mirror, though, is a reflection not only couple, but the figures right there represent us. We're the witnesses to the wedding. It's a pretty incredible amount of detail to pack in such a small space. Robert Campin is sometimes referred to as the master of Flamel. Are a number of works that originally were attached to an abbey church in Flamel, and that work was collectively believed to be one artist, and scholars have decided that Robert Campin, who was known as the author of some works, is in fact the same person. The work shares enough similarity that people now believe that he and what we refer to previously as the Master of Flamel are one and the same person. So in this Rodi altarpiece, we have our patrons there on the far left. In the center, we have an Annunciation, and on the right, you have Joseph. He's referred to in Burgundian theology as the mousetrap of the devil. And of course, he was a woodworker, so you see him there actually making mousetraps. The figures in the middle, though, are probably the single most interesting, I think, for all of us. When we look in the very center, incredible detail in the book on the table. We can see the single candle again. You can see these lilies that represent the flower of the Virgin. It's also kind of odd, though, because everything on that table that we were just looking at, it feels as though the table's tilted upwards. In fact, the floor plane in this room feels like it's tilted very much up. And that's something we would not see in Italian Renaissance at all. And it does feel as though the main figures are really, really close to us, or close to the picture plane. The announcing angel is telling Mary, of course, that Christ's child. She doesn't seem perturbed in this rendition, but what's kind of fascinating is there's a lot of light falling right on the set there. That light is coming from the window, aiming right toward the womb. And if we zoom in again, take a look at close. Can you see the figure of Christ there flying on these kind of sunbeams? It's sort of a fascinating example of making a depiction of the story of the Annunciation. Another piece to know for the test is Roger van der Weyden's descent from the cross. And again, you've figures crammed really, really close to the front of the picture plane, almost like they're spilling into our space. One of the most gruesome depictions in fiction. You can see a lot more blood in these northern paintings than you would see in the Italian Renaissance. But I think the most compelling in some ways is the way that the figure of Mary mimics the pose of the figure of Christ. Remember that he is the sacrifice of humanity, right? And that his death is to save our souls. So what you're seeing is sort of a humanization of this, or a prefigure intercession between us and God is going to work as his own mother kind of succumbs to her sorrow. She almost looks dead if you look at her skin. Suggestion there that there's a connection between the pain that we feel and what Christ has taken on our behalf. Definitely wanted you to take a look at the work as well, kind of an interesting northern Renaissance painter who gives us an incredible amount of detail in the just the fabrics, but if you take a look at some of the objects here, the gifts from the Magi are pretty gorgeous. Van der Gogh was a painter who really became important for Italy because of this commission. This piece was commissioned for a family chapel in Florence. And when the painting arrived in 1475, you can imagine that the Italian painters kind of were blown away by the level of objects, the fabric, etc. And so this painting kind of pushed the Italian Renaissance even a little bit further for the need or the desire to include more detail, the desire to make things feel more and more three-dimensional. And of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that the painting only on a fairly large scale, but also with oil paint. You can see a lot of interesting aspects here in terms of the Northern Renaissance paintings. Almost every object is going to have a symbolic meaning. Joseph's discarded shoe is there in the front left-hand side. The scarlet lily represents the blood of sacrifice. We also have romantic associations with all placed here in the front. It's really kind of an amazing painting. The image on the side is pretty interesting as well. We've got Saint Mary Magdalene and Maria Portinari. She is the wife of this figure. They are the patrons who commissioned the piece. Saint Margaret that you see beside her is in fact Margaret of Antioch, martyred in the year 304, and one of the miracles that she is associated with was that she was swallowed by Satan, who appeared to her in the form of a dragon, and she escaped alive from experience when the cross that she was carrying irritated the dragon's stomach. And if you look, there's the dragon's face. Can you imagine if this impressed the Italian painters? That central panel is really kind of everything about what makes Hugo van der Gogh such a remarkable painter, such an inspiration to the Italian painters. This is the work of Hieronymus Bosch. I would definitely take a look at some of his early works. The one on the left is kind of a quack medicine cure for folly. They are trying to extract the madness literally by cutting the head open and trying to remove bad pieces of it. Pretty remarkable, bizarre story. It is part of an overall campaign of ideas that we would no longer practice today in medicine. The Seven Deadly Sins tabletop painting includes this disturbing image of gluttony. You certainly see the effect in there. The Bosch piece to know for the test is the Garden of Earthly Delights, and we'll get to it, but we have to look at the outside of it first, because the Garden of Earthly Delights is the center painting in an altarpiece, and this is the altarpiece with its wings closed. Hieronymus Bosch was Orthodox Catholic in his own right, and he created this painting for private use, but it was for Henry III, the regent of the Netherlands, for a royal aristocratic client for use in a private chapel. So it's absolutely a religious painting, although it may not seem such when we open it. Essentially, the whole of the Christian universe. You've got heaven, earth, and the suggestion of hell below. When we open the painting, we have three panels. These are the insides of what you just saw, and when they fold in, they cover this central section. This is the Garden of Earthly Delights. On the left, we have what appears to be the paradise, two nude figures with animals. That's Adam and Eve in the garden. Panel, you have sort of depraved acts of humanity taking place. It's sort of symbolically representing the temptations in our world and people succumbing to them. So the last panel then becomes the wages of sin. This is the souls cast into hell, and you can see it's on fire. It is peopled with all kinds of strange animal-human hybrid demons, and souls are being tortured in a variety of different ways in that image. The paradise really contrasts with hell when you see it side by side like that. They almost look like they're emotional states and totally different mental states. You can see the same level of quality in the painting and in the technique, but there's more information, I think, packed into the hell panel. The centerpiece, the Garden of Earthly Delights, really is somewhat ahead of, like it could almost have been painted by Salvador Dali. There are things that look like animal-human hybrids even here. There's this odd prawn that seems to be some kind of carriage that these people are carrying around. There are what look to be trees that are also sort of teepees, and when we count the feet inside there, there's at least 5 feet, which means there's at least 3 naked people crammed into that space. All kinds of naughty shenanigans happening all over this entire canvas. So at first glance, people possibly be a religious painting. It's not that this is meant to glorify these. If anything, it's reminding you that the world you live in is full of temptations. It's easy to give in to temptation and to stop and to do things that may be pleasurable in the moment, because you might have forgotten what the wages of sin are. When you see the sins that are going on, you can see people are absolutely having a blast in this temptation-filled world. But when you see the consequence, it may to paint in a different way. You can see that for every sin that's on that center panel, there's a consequence on this being tortured in horrific ways. The part that scares me the most personally is the figure being swallowed by this bird-faced demon who's then for pits of hell. Really an intense and almost surreal vision. And that's very much what Bosch is known for. Pieces are quite often in triptychs. This one is called the hay wagon. This is the outer panels closed. The proverb that it addresses is that the world is a heap of hay and that everyone takes from it anything he can grab. And you have paradise on one side, hell on the other side, and in the center is the hay wagon. You can see all of these people going about all kinds of murder taking place here. So this one is maybe a little more direct reference for us, seeing that we're always kind of between an and we have a choice to make, that we're either going to give up the possible paradise for hell if we don't make the right choice. He has a lot of paintings along this same kind of theme.